Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining our panel on pandemic unemployment benefits, where Kafka meets fraud. I can't even say that. Thanks for the title, Jeremy. Um, we only have a short panel today, so in the interest of getting conversation going, I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panelists, starting with Linda Miller. Linda is a principal in Grant Thornton LLP's advisory services practice, where she leads the fraud and financial crimes group. Prior to joining Grant Thornton, she served as Deputy Executive Director of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, which we will definitely be talking about later, an oversight body responsible for preventing and detecting fraud, waste, and abuse of the $5 trillion in pandemic relief funds. Next, we have Julia Simon Michelle. Julia is a supervising attorney of unemployment compensation at Philadelphia Legal Assistance, where she represents low-wage workers in unemployment matters. She recently served by appointment on Pennsylvania's Unemployment Compensation Benefit Modernization Advisory Committee. Next, we have Blake Hall, who is the founder and CEO of ID.me, a digital identity network that enables people to securely prove and share their identity online, and also a big topic of conversation today. A former Army Ranger, Blake won 2 Bronze Stars while serving in Iraq from 2006 to 2007. Blake holds 3 patents related to authentication and has been recognized as the top veteran entrepreneurs in the country by Inc. magazine. Finally, we have Michelle Evermore, Deputy Director of Policy in the Office of Unemployment Insurance Modernization at the Department of Labor. She previously served as a senior policy advisor at the agency, and before that was a researcher and analyst at the National Employment Law Project. So before we get started on the state of affairs now, I was wondering, Michelle, if we could start and then go down the line, just to give our audience a little taste of what exactly unemployment benefits technology looked like before we got to the pandemic. That way we can see where it kind of went from there.
So I would say just prior to the pandemic, I think around 16 or 18 states had quote unquote fully modernized unemployment insurance IT systems. But the term modernization in that context generally just means move to the cloud. It doesn't really mean that that there was an effort to optimize claimant experience or really modernize in a lot of the ways we typically think about it. And so we had a majority of systems still operating either all or in part on 1970s COBOL mainframes. I would say prior to the pandemic, ID verification was not something that unemployment insurance did. In order to apply for and receive regular unemployment insurance benefits for regular UI, a claimant would have to the agency actually has to verify with the employer that the person lost their work for the reason that they said that they lost their work. And so the employer who actually let you go has to verify that you're entitled to benefits. And so that's a pretty high bar right there. But as we went into the pandemic, and I'm sure as we're going to talk about here, pandemic benefits had a different bar for entry. And that's sort of what led to the mountains of fraud that started coming in.
Linda, being on the pandemic advisory committee, when you were thinking about how to counteract fraud or prevent it, or where waste and abuse might come from, were you factoring in what the technology looked like at the time, or were you kind of going in blind as to what might be the core problems here?
Well, as Susan mentioned earlier when she did her fireside chat, the PRAC is a conglomeration of 22 inspectors general. And so the Department of Labor Inspector General obviously has a lot of knowledge about how the state IT systems are. So it's not as though the Department of Labor IG was unaware of the technological limitations that Michelle just referenced. And I think the thing that's interesting is when you flood a program like this with money, that's when you start to realize just how problematic it is to have the majority of your programs operating on 1970s technology. And so, it's one of those things where it wasn't as though it was unknown. It was just that the scope of that problem was never realized until literally, hundreds of billions of dollars was shoveled out through those systems. And then you realize just where all the weaknesses are. It's kind of like, pressure testing whether your 100-year-old pipes work in your bathroom by, shoving water down it and seeing if it comes through your kitchen ceiling. And if it does, they didn't work. And that's kind of what we saw with the unemployment insurance. So the PRAC, certainly the Department of Labor IG was aware of those challenges, but I don't think anybody was prepared for how badly they were exploited.
Mm-hmm. Blake or Julia, do you want to?
Yeah, I would just comment that I agree with all the comments that were made. In one of the states that we support in the South, it's important to remember before the pandemic, unemployment rates were historically low. This state had literally just cut its workforce in half. And then all of a sudden you have this global pandemic where unemployment jumps up from 3.8%, to 14.8%, which is the highest it's been since the Congressional Research Service was tracking it. You have all these new stimulus programs that introduced tremendous administrative work. And then, as Susan pointed out, everything was based on the honor system. And that's where folks just took all these, socials and names and dates that cost $2 on the dark web and really just flooded the system with fraud. And of course, when there's that much fraud, it just really destroys access for legitimate folks. And I think it's in the same way that a hurricane with like New Orleans is a low probability but high catastrophic event if it happens. That's kind of exactly what happened to the technology infrastructure and processes tied to unemployment when this pandemic arrived very suddenly.
I'll add that this is part of the kind of continuum of issues that we face as we move government services online, right? Historically, people walked into an unemployment office and applied there in person. Right. It was only in the early 2000s that we moved away from that to a call center model. And now most states are trying to push people through purely online applications. Right. So very different than somebody having to call and answer the questions of an examiner over the phone to take their initial application. And that really kind of opened the door to this, especially when states were just overrun with claims and did not have the staff to even answer their phones to take the claims of legitimate claimants who wanted to call in and to do that. I also want to be careful, as much as I have issues with the mainframe systems in place, they were not necessarily at fault for the fact that we saw this increase in fraud. And I can say that just based purely on Pennsylvania, because we were operating on a COBOL system with our regular unemployment program until June 2021. And it was only once we modernized to a system that was the same system we had been offering for our pandemic program offered by a private vendor that we saw a huge spike in identity fraud cases, such that it went past the point that Michelle mentioned earlier, which was, individual employers can identify for the departments when fraudulent claims are being filed, right? Because they get something, they say, oh, this person is still working for me, or they didn't work for me, or things like that. But once you're getting 500 applications in a week from unemployment to a particular employer, it makes it almost impossible for them to flag that. So I just want to be careful that we don't blame this necessarily on purely kind of mainframe technology.
And Julia, coming off of that, as someone who works directly with clients and individuals who have had to go through this process or this transition, was there a moment when you realized things had just completely changed for the individuals you were working with and kind of the services they needed had been changed by the way this technology was being implemented?
Well, I think the first thing happened when last summer we just had hundreds of thousands of people cut off from benefits here in Pennsylvania because they had been flagged for potential fraud. And trying to get people back onto benefits has been a real challenge, even now, for folks who were cut off from last summer. What we came to realize is that part of the problem was how we did initial fraud detection and flagging. Right? What data points were being focused on to just identify what claim they needed to actually look at more closely. And then, of course, once it came to then trying to establish, what many of us, I guess not those attending this conference think is simple, but proving you are who you say you are, folks really started to struggle. It's when you really come to understand how many people lack personal identification documents. And that's especially true when you're trying to access government benefits during a crisis, right? Many people at this time have moved, they've lost their home, they're staying somewhere different. A lot of their documentation doesn't align with their current address. And on top of all of that, they've been traumatized, right? They are in this system because they are experiencing trauma, and it makes it much more difficult for them to understand new identity verification processes and try to take the outside steps necessary to get documentation that is now required for them to prove their identity. Whereas for many of them, a phone call to the agency, right, talking on the phone with a human could solve a lot of these problems, as opposed to the multiple steps they're required to do in an online process. So we have definitely seen a lot of barriers for low-income individuals, especially a lot of our BIPOC clients, when it comes to trying to establish their identity in the variety of different new technologies that have been applied to the unemployment system.
Just one more follow-up for you, Julia. Have you, we're talking about an almost 2-year time span now. Have those difficulties changed over time, or are we still kind of coming up against the same hurdles as the beginning of the pandemic?
So they've changed over time, in that at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of it was about people being flagged and then having to establish who they are. Right now, identity verification is actually just blocking access from the get-go. Right? If you can't apply, if you can't prove your identity, you're not even allowed to apply for benefits in the state of Pennsylvania, right? And so it's a very different process in terms of where people are being cut off. And so it affects people in different ways. There's different due process issues that come into play with that. But the core issue, which is that a lot of individuals in our country just don't have documentation that establishes their identity, remains the same.
Can I provide a few comments to Julia? Because I do very much agree with her that there should always be an in-person verification flow for folks to go through. And when we entered, and we support now 27 states with identity verification services for folks. There were tens of thousands of folks, and sometimes hundreds of thousands in each of those states that were legitimate, who'd been blocked by fraud algorithms at the state level, and the state was unable to parse the fraudulent applicants from legitimate applicants. And that had gotten so bad that California's unemployment agency, EDD, actually shut down completely for the last 2 weeks of September, where they weren't processing anybody. So there was a complete loss of access in that agency, shut down completely. And if you looked at the stats for California, there was a great government strike team report. They were only able to manually process 2,400 claims a day. They were getting over 20,000 claims a day. And you can kind of do the math on that. You never catch up. And that's how these folks that Susan talked about that had their identity stolen because it was the honor system, we're waiting weeks and months without recourse for help. And so, in Florida, for instance, there were these fraud algorithms that had flagged 52,000 people. And we were asked to come in to provide identity verification to automate, the process to restore access to their services. And we unblocked over 11,000 people. Mind you, like only 26% of folks tried to verify. So the vast majority were indeed fraudulent, but nearly 1 out of 4 were legitimate. And for those folks, we verified 86%, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, within 24 to 48 hours. And we got feedback from one of those folks in Florida, and she said, or he said rather, I just had the absolute pleasure to be verified by Tiffany over a Zoom meeting. I would like to say that Tiffany was the first person I spoke to in many weeks regarding being locked out of my account, who made me feel optimistic and hopeful over difficult times like this. Just having a positive attitude and showing a little compassion, goes a long way. And so when we went into California, we were also able to just enable that agency to reopen. They were completely closed. When Pennsylvania moved their traditional UI system, distinct from PUA, to the cloud system, they did not have identity verification in place right away. And immediately, those same issues that had clogged and shut down the system in 2020 replicated themselves right away. Business owners were overwhelmed with fraudulent claims. It was clearly unsustainable. We saw on the dark web just chatter skyrocket. And again, they said, okay, we need identity verification, right away. And so there is no talking about like access and equity without the fact that like these international crime rings are hammering the system with stolen identities, and they make matters complicated because agencies need to be able to separate those fraudulent claims from legitimate ones. Now, with that being said, we were very transparent when we went in that we felt that we could get 91% of legitimate applicants through. And in fact, even in that Florida case, those are like the hardest folks to verify. Like every single one of them is blocked, has some fraud algorithm or something from a records or data broker on them. And we were still able to get 86% of that population. Governor Newsom did a press conference on this as well. Every government agency we work with has an in-person pathway to verify.
Like, I just want to, we could, instead of talking about every state, I just want to kind of look at the bigger picture here. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about how these statistics changed as you scaled up, we talked about this a little bit in the prep call, as you went from Florida and California and Pennsylvania to 27 different states. And, it seems like some of those same issues with systems being overwhelmed repeated themselves in the private sector. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the realities of what that was, how your business dealt with that.
Yeah, sure. So the final point I'll make is I agree with Julia. There always needs to be an in-person verification option for folks who have difficulty with digital skills. We have always been an advocate for that. When we realized that these states were so overwhelmed that they were shutting down their in-person processes, that's shocking. That's not what we signed up for. It's not what we committed to. There needs to be an in-person access option. We've deployed one. Now, when it comes to verification, and I can talk as well, again, about why these controls were important to stop stolen identity. We adhere to the federal guidelines for identity verification, NIST 800-63-3, Identity Assurance Level 2, and Authenticator Assurance Level 2. So we are bound by those guidelines that are set by the privacy and security experts at NIST. And as far as documentation, we look to the issuing DMV for guidance, on extending expiration dates, which a lot of them did, because ultimately we defer to the government agency that has authority over, each particular area, like authentication standards, and so on and so forth. The most challenging thing about managing the demand during the pandemic is that roughly 90% of folks at federal agencies go through a self-serve flow that takes a few minutes that can scale for forever. 10% of folks need to go through video chat. And it turns out at state workforce agencies, folks were more likely to move. And so that ratio moved closer to like 85-15. And so the video chat demand, is something that can't scale, automatically. It requires notice and training, just like states need training, and time to scale up their support centers. And so what repeated itself as a challenge throughout the pandemic was you had like Arizona, state of 7,570,000 claims in a week, went down to 6,700. When they saw the magnitude of fraud and how few legitimate applicants were there as a percentage, they sent all their continuing claims that had accumulated over 6 months for processing within IDMe for 2 weeks. And so, of course, video chat wait times went up to several hours, but already by the end of December and early January, they were back down under 30 minutes. California then, gave us 10 days notice or so.
I just want to cut you off there, mentioning that they're under 30 minutes. Julia, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the wait times that you've seen recently. Just looking online, there are individuals saying they're waiting up to 15 hours at a time. Julia, someone who works on the ground with this, like, does 30 minutes seem like an accurate estimation to you?
Sorry, just to clarify, well, wait time for what? Are we talking specifically about the IDMe system, or are we talking about the wait time to actually get your identity verified as a whole and get access to your benefits? Because they're two very different things.
I believe we were talking about wait time for a video chat, but Blake, if you want to clarify.
Well, my point, because that's kind of a leading question, my point is that video chat wait times varied over time because there was excessive, like an extreme one-time demand to clear out like a year's worth of claims that had accumulated, but that those video chat wait times stabilized. And in fact, since the Child Advance Tax Credit launched on June 20th, the average video chat wait time has been 8 minutes all the way through December 31st, which is why there's no reports that are out there, about it, because that demand was both forecasted and sustainable. During the pandemic, we were getting, 10 days notice that 1 million plus claims are going to come through for California. And so, of course, there will be periods of time, and we have that graph where wait times will have gone up. But that was driven by, not only processing new claims, but going back in and clearing out, multiple months worth of fraudulent claims. So at the end of April, it was Florida, Nevada, Colorado, were all sending their year's worth of claims that had accumulated from 2020 to 2021 while those new claims were going through. And states were so desperate to stop the fraud.
I think Julia wanted to chime in there.
Yeah, sorry, just to get back to this. So Tanya, the point here is twofold, right? So what Blake's talking about is access to their trusted referee, the video process for trying to establish your identity through ID.me. So 2 points. First, not every state is using ID.me, right? So being able to get through to a trusted referee on ID.me does not solve the problem for many people in this country, right? Second, I do want to give Blake and ID.me props for stepping in to provide a solution at a time of major crisis, but as he's acknowledged, there were significant issues with scaling up that were understandable during that, where we did see incredibly long wait times. I will say what we're seeing now is significantly less, but we've also moved outside of the point where most pandemic benefits are available, right? So there's a lot less need right now than there was before. But that's not, even if I'm a claimant and I need to establish my identity and I need to use something like ID.me, just because I get through to a trusted referee and I prove my identity and ID.me checks off the box, you have a little verification thing in your account, that doesn't mean I get through to my benefits, right? And then it has to go back to a state agency, which is often operating completely separately from ID.me and says they're kind of hands off, right? Like, we have nothing to do with identity. It's all a private vendor now, right? And then you as an individual, often in a moment of trauma and crisis, are trying to figure out why the state doesn't recognize that you've verified your identity or hasn't taken the next step or how to get back into your account, right? What we've done is we've created kind of a brand new eligibility requirement that didn't exist in the unemployment system before, which is that in order to be eligible for benefits, you have to prove you are you, but there's very little due process that now goes along with that element and very little communication to claimants. I think what has probably been discussed, in different panels and will be continuously discussed is, where is the line between communicating in a way that is helpful to people and sharing too much information such that you continue to support the fraudsters, right? Or giving them access to things that
I see you unmuted yourself. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I think, Julia, you're bringing up a great point. So from my perspective, sort of observing what's been happening over the last nearly 2 years, identity proofing is sort of like, it follows the Pareto principle, I would say. It probably works for 80% of the people who have access to a computer and have documents that they can verify, and the variety of things. They've got a cell phone they can take their selfie with. All of these things work for them, and they can get into a system and verify their identity. Great, but it doesn't address the 20%. And I think what Julia is talking about is the 20%. And like, that's, I believe that the Pareto principle is probably accurate here. It's probably 20% of people that just don't have the documentation, or they don't have access to a device that would allow them to upload and do that selfie. They have mistrust of federal agencies. They're here illegally. There's a variety of things that will dissuade and or create barriers for people to use an identity proofing solution. And so while I think it's incredibly beneficial and has reduced fraud a lot, we have a long way to go as an anti-fraud community when it deals with government beneficiaries, to come up with a solution that's going to address the fact that many government beneficiaries are vulnerable people, And this solution isn't a solution for vulnerable people. And so we aren't where we need to be, and we need to keep going. And it's not that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. The baby's really good. We just need more. It's not an either or, it's a both and.
Right.
And I'll just add, I completely agree on the 20%, and that's often the majority of our clients. But I will say that even the 80% that are able to use a system like ID.me, there are still significant issues when we add something like identity proofing to a government benefit process, and outsource it, right? Because it's not fully integrated with the states. The states don't have a linear way for people to go from point A to point B to get their benefits when they have to go through an outside identity sourcing module. And part of this is it's all still very new. But part of it is that this is not in the law anywhere. There are no policies, there are no procedures. It's kind of the wild, wild west for those of us who are working with individuals trying to gain access to their benefits. So separate from just, can you prove your identity, when you add requirements like this to a government benefit process, there is a kind of a waterfall effect in terms of other things that happen.
Can I just talk for a second about that? What the Department of Labor is doing to wrangle these cattle out in the wild, wild west. I just wanted to talk very quickly about some of the stuff that we're working on that I'm very excited about. So as a lot of folks know, Congress allocated to the Department of Labor $2 billion to help state systems fight fraud, promote timeliness, and promote equity. And one huge goal of our work on this is to develop central modular technologies that states can use to build on, so that there's sort of a central code base. Obviously, going back to the 80-20, that actually also applies to tech. So about 80% of tech across states is similar. About 20% of it is customized to that state's laws. What we are working on is a vision to build, about 80% that states can use. They can take the code to integrate into their systems. In order to do that, we have to start with small digestible pilots. Our first pilot isn't that small, actually, and it's answering one of the biggest questions that states have, which is integrating ID verification in a smooth way for the claimant. And so our first pilot is a claimant experience pilot that will allow for claimants to log in, go through identity verification, have that identity verification flow smoothly back into the state system, and also make sure that the state's asking questions that are understandable to claimants. And I have great hopes for this this initial pilot. There are currently 2 states that are participating with it, Arkansas and New Jersey. And another thing that I would say about the Department of Labor getting engaged in this kind of work is they've never done it before. The most that the Department of Labor really did with states on IT modernization was offer states a checklist. So actually getting in under the hood and dealing with the systems directly is a whole new challenge for us. And so it involves a lot of learning on our end. So, the state participation in this is very labor intensive on their part. So I just want to, shout out to those states that are engaging with us to make this a smooth experience for claimants. But hopefully at the other end of this, this pilot will have sort of a model for making it easier for states to integrate ID verification.
Mm-hmm. We had a quick audience question that I think would actually be really informative to this discussion. Someone was asking if we know sort of the data of fraudulent claims that come through online versus, someone calling up a call center or doing it that way. Do we have any basis of comparison of what overall going online actually means for fraud numbers?
Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, from a DOL perspective, I don't think that we necessarily track improper payment by intake method. That's something that I would have to find out and report back. Anecdotally, what I hear from state workforce agencies is that the fraudsters aren't generally likely to get on the phone. But I defer to others if they have different experiences.
My only comment here is that, fraud moves like water. So it'll look for the path of least resistance. Typically in-person verification and, spending time on the phone is certainly a less profitable use of time. So if they have a way to scale up an attack, they're going to look for the weakest link in the chain. And that's kind of consistently what has happened, that once, these rings targeted agencies and they got used to their programs. That's why Pennsylvania said, let's remove identity verification for UI. And then boom, like fraud immediately went right through that. And that was widely reported, which is why they had to race to move back to the identity verification that the Consolidated Appropriations Act had required for unemployment benefits. There's 2 points I want to make that I think are really critical, which is that the notion of outsourcing could be conflated with various things. Like the reality is that for digital services, the government has used data brokers and credit bureaus, for decades to verify identity. They continue to do that today, and the success rates through those solutions, are less than 30% at some agencies. They're demonstrably lower. And so when you come back to, you want to make the digital pathway as secure and efficient as possible, you also need relief valves, which is what we had kind of preached as well coming in. Like we're confident we can get 9 out of 10 and shrink this 15% problem, down closer to 2%, which you can handle, and then give that concierge service to those vulnerable folks that are most in need, and acknowledging that states often have different policies than the federal government on certain classes of individuals, like undocumented individuals here in this country, right? So there has to be, that balance between state and federal power as well. But, whether it goes through like a government system, it's going to hit LexisNexis or it's going to hit credit bureaus. So and Jeremy Grant's got a great, series of tweets on that to clear it up. The government has always relied upon the private sector to do this. Now, the problem with state workforce agencies is that 1980s technology and COBOL, all of our integrations with federal agencies are direct integrations through federated protocols like SAML 2.0 and OpenID Connect and things of that nature. Many of the processes at state workforce agencies were so manual that we would, need to verify and then send data over in bulk. And then they had all these like UiPath robots for manual processes, and then reviewers downstream from the identity verification that Julia was talking about. And so again, it becomes more of a matter of technology execution as far as how you can integrate it. And as these, workforce agencies were trying to integrate identity verification on the fly during a pandemic, there were serious challenges with their ability to support an integration like the model that we have at the federal agencies that are fully tied together, where there are no gaps, in terms of data transfer. It's instant, and it maps directly to the claim that individual is trying to further. So I just wanted to add a little bit more color on those topics as well.
And Tanya, I'd have a really hard time believing that there was significant imposter fraud by telephone application prior to the pandemic and even during the pandemic, but it's hard to ever actually evaluate that, because part of the problem with something like the pandemic is that individuals can't even get through on the phone to the vast majority of state agencies across the country. And what that means is that you're actually then pushing the individuals who often fall within that 20%, who would most struggle with technology, to then have to file through an online system and go through all the requirements that come along with that. And so as we push people more and more through online systems, I think, you're opening yourself up to more imposter fraud, and you're also then making the application process and the verification process much more difficult for individuals who are already struggling with these systems.
Well, and I would just note, Tanya, that, that's why Nigerian, North Korean, Russian, and Chinese fraud rings, they took advantage of what we're talking about here, the complexity of outdated IT systems, massive different 50 different states trying to run 50 different programs with guidance from the Department of Labor, with unprecedented amounts of money, with unprecedented numbers of people unemployed during the middle of a public health crisis when everybody was working from home. And so, this chaos that we're talking about right now, that is what facilitated. And I think it's important to note that 40%, that's an estimate, we don't even know, it could be higher, of the money that was stolen from unemployment insurance went overseas. And it didn't go overseas to like France. It went overseas to North Korea and Nigeria and Russia and China. It went to our enemies. it's probably funding a lot of terrorist organizations right now. It's not just, oh, we lost a bunch of money. Our taxpayer money went to our adversaries overseas. And so this problem is massive. It has huge repercussions. And so when Julia is talking very clearly about the struggles, the victims here, the victims are the individuals who didn't get their benefits, the individuals who struggled to pay their rents, who maybe even got evicted from their homes because they didn't have enough money to pay. And we're also talking about, nation state actors, infiltrating our antiquated systems and using that and stealing money that they're now going to use for nefarious purposes that are of national security concern to us as a country. So the magnitude is huge, the consequences are huge, and the people who've been affected by it on both sides there's an enormous scale and variety of victims here.
Linda, I just want to stay with you a moment. One big question that we haven't gotten to yet that I think drives a lot of this discussion around modernization is how much fraud is actually going on. And I think a lot of people were surprised, during the pandemic to find that the federal government doesn't have really good data on this. And so we're kind of working through, combining state data, or ID.me has presented its own data. Is the fact that the federal government doesn't have substantial data on this a problem for solving the problem?
Yeah, there's a lot. Well, data and the federal government are two words that together create lots and lots of problems. There's just the data system is broken in the federal government and in the state government by definition, and that has to do with data collection, which is in many cases still paper and not digital. It has to do with data use and the limited ability of federal and state agencies to even have analytics capabilities to use data in a meaningful way. And then data sharing, which is a whole enormous problem in government, both among federal agencies as well as federal and state agencies. So yeah, one of the issues that the Department of Labor IG pointed out clearly at the beginning of the pandemic was there's a clearinghouse that was created by the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, NASWA, that is supposed to be collecting information that states can use to compare whether if they've seen like bad actors in one state that they may be acting, but many of them turned off those alerts. They didn't use those data sharing mechanisms. So they either never had access that could have been a technology issue, or they were so overwhelmed they turned off the alerts. So they didn't do any data matching. So even during the process, what data were available were not being used by the state agencies in the unemployment insurance program. So that's sort of like an obvious problem, and it was pointed out by the DOL OIG, and I think most states are now rectifying that issue. But the bigger problem, Tanya, is that there's very limited data on where this is coming from. There very little information is collected. Many of the states and the federal government don't have the ability to verify self-reported information. I mean, obviously the pandemic unemployment assistance, it wasn't required, which was the biggest problem. We know for a fact in the fraud world that not verifying self-reported information is the #1 cause of improper payments and fraud. Verifying that you're eligible for this benefit. We know there's going to be a ton of fraud. So everyone knew these programs were going to be high fraud, but in it was the fraud tolerance was up because it was a public health emergency and an economic emergency. And so, we accept as taxpayers that there's going to be more fraud in a situation like this because it's an emergency, it's a disaster. But the staggering lack of data that agencies have, that they collect and that they share, is contributing to this problem. And someone mentioned earlier synthetic identities, I think during James Lee's presentation. And I believe that a lot of the fraudsters that have stolen these identities now are going to start using those identity and pieces of those identities to create synthetic identity fraud, which is then going to they might give unemployment insurance a pass now. Now there's focus on that. The DOL is putting money out, they're modernizing their systems. They know they had a problem. There's a lot of other state benefit agencies that have antiquated software and lack of controls and and they're going to just shift over there. We're already seeing that happening with disability insurance. They're starting to see identity theft based fraud and identity in disability insurance. So it's going to be really important for states not to just, sometimes the federal government does this thing where they look at the one shiny object and they put all their money and attention. So it's like pandemic unemployment assistance was so bad, let's put all our money there. And it clearly needed help, but we can't take our eye off the ball of the fact that there needs to be a better job across the board of collecting data and enabling agencies to use data, and then data sharing, which is a government that's a statutory issue that needs to be addressed in order to allow the agencies to share the data with one another.
Before
Can I
we
jump in real quick,
Oh,
please?
yes.
Just to check sort of like sort of an underlying assumption here that we're not tracking fraud, that we're not aware of what fraud is, that we're, while we have not been, while we don't have numbers on overpayments in pandemic unemployment assistance, we track it very closely and are very concerned about it in the regular UI program. And so I will tell you the improper payment rate for 2020, 2021 was 18.71%. Of that, about $1 billion, of that 78 billion, about $1 billion was confirmed fraud. The overpayment rate is 17.88%. The underpayment rate is 0.83%. It's important to note that we do very closely track all the reasons that people get benefits that they weren't necessarily entitled to and why. During the 2020, 2021 year for the regular UI program, the biggest reason that people got overpaid, there were two main reasons people got overpaid. Number one was there was confusion about the reason for separation. Number two was that they worked in a week and didn't report those earnings in a non-fraudulent way. They made a mistake. I just wanted to clarify there that we do actually keep that the regular unemployment insurance program is very serious about integrity, but we are now working on a methodology to establish who got overpaid in PUA and why. I should point out that when a new program is put in place, a methodology of establishing improper payments it isn't required for a program that lasts less than a year. So we're only now, working out how to establish how much was overpaid to who and why in PUA benefits.
Also, just quickly add that the other issue with data here is that very rarely do we have good demographic data with any of this as well, which makes it really hard to fully understand the equity impacts, right? When we're talking about this, about who's getting through, who's harmed. And so it does make it harder in analysis going forward if we don't know the demographics of those who are both harmed as victims of the fraud, victims in that they can't get through to their benefits, or of what type of individuals are having their identity stolen. So there's a lot more data that can be used, but we also need to be really clear about the fact that we need demographic information so that we can fully understand and take action on the equity aspect of this.
I want to try to get to just one last audience question before we wrap up. And this might be a little complicated, but for whoever wants to jump in, the question was referring to British Columbia had done its own verified by video system that used video and it used text, and it was government run. The question is, why couldn't state and city agencies in the USA use a combination of text messaging, video, and identity documents themselves instead of a private firm? And I think we talked a little bit about NIST standards earlier, but is there, does anyone else want to jump in about kind of what the where there might be differences or why the US didn't go in that direction?
Well, I'll just first say part of it's a staffing issue. Like we drastically underfund these state agencies, and we had for the decade before this pandemic hit. And it's not easy to staff up during something like a pandemic. And it's certainly not easy to train folks to do things like this when they are working remotely. And I like you even said that, on the corporate side, right? That's a difficult thing to do. And so I do think there is this immediate thought of, okay, well, we can just have someone else do this, right? So oftentimes corporate hiring is actually much faster than government hiring because of a variety of different requirements and civil service issues. And so I do think there is an ideal world here where the states are engaging in that type of work, right? Do have that type of communication, but it's a staffing issue, and B, as Michelle said, that is related to kind of what technology they have at hand, how it's integrated into their systems. And so it sounds like what USDOL is doing could be a really great first step in figuring out a way for states to take lead on something like that in the future.
I would make the point too that it's going to be the same private sector identity vendors that are in there, whether the government is running the system or not. And the government was just simply unprepared to meet the demands of the pandemic on this 1980s technology. And so the reason why they turned to us is that the government needed a solution that was not only certified, but objectively had the records-based software flow, the video chat relief valve, in order to get the maximum number of people through. What went wrong here is that the in-person verification relief valve that should always be there was also taken away. That should not be an either or thing. And the point that I would make is that government control should never be moved ahead of access and equity. You need both the digital channel to work super efficiently, and you need to provide relief valves for those who are most in need. And when we realized the state workforce agencies were so understaffed and overwhelmed, we built an in-person verification capability. It's deployed in New Jersey rather. We also support tens of languages, Haitian Creole and Armenian, things that other government programs, if you look at the language support for claims versus what's now available in identity.
We've run over time a little bit. I know we could probably all talk about this for another hour, and certainly only scratch the surface of this conversation, but just so we can keep today's events moving along, I just want to thank everyone for their time today. Thank you, Blake, Linda, Julia, Michelle. This was a great conversation, and as I said, like a lot more to talk about here, and I'm sure we all will be in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. Good to see everyone.
Thanks, everybody. I'm glad we had a lively panel there. I'm sorry we ran out of time, though. It was good to have everybody coming, a lot of different perspectives. We're going to take a break until 1 o'clock Eastern time, and then we'll be back with the panel that I will be moderating, looking at, now that we've heard a lot about the problems, let's talk about some things that government can actually do to help. So grab a bite to eat, take a break, and we'll see you in about 14 minutes. Thank you.